Hello YouTube, welcome back to Brunger Builds. Today, I'll be experimenting with mud and other wet weathering techniques during the build of this Mimban Stormtrooper helmet. Alright, for starters, this base Stormtrooper helmet is a paid file from the Galactic Armory. The blast shield is a file I found on Thingiverse and then modified to fit my needs. I will link them as well as all the materials I used down in the description below. Galactic Armory files typically come with the option to print the helmet as one complete piece or in separated pieces. I've started printing my helmets in separate pieces because if a print fails, it's a lot easier to reprint one piece instead of having to redo the entire helmet. Doing it this way does add a bit of extra time to your prep work, which is kind of a pain, but in my opinion, it's worth it. To assemble the helmet, I use 5-minute epoxy and a couple dabs of superglue. The superglue sets quickly and holds the pieces in place while the epoxy dries. Once the epoxy is mostly dry, I use my plastic welder and go back over every seam with some staples just to make sure it's extra secure. The blast shield is made to have a pretty tight fit on the brim of the helmet, and so I masked both of those sections up before filling so that when it came time for final assembly, both pieces would be glued together plastic on plastic and have an extra strong bond. I then broke out my trusty wood filler and went to town. While the wood filler dried, I sanded the resin printed parts. For anything that needs to be sanded but isn't going to be seen on the final product, I'm usually using 120 grit just to quickly remove material. For parts that are going to be seen, I'm usually using 220 grit and then finishing with 400. For the wood filler on the helmet, I'm also using 120 grit to remove most of the material, and once I get close to the surface of the helmet, I switch to 220. I think I may have ended up sanding this helmet a bit too aggressively, and so I ended up needing to do a couple extra passes of filler primer. When it came time to sand the primer, I just did a quick pass of 220 grit and didn't do a 400 grit pass since I knew that the mud would cover most of the paint job. For paint, I used Rust-Oleum's 2X Satin in white and black. I'm not sure if I just have bad luck, but it seems like to me white paint is always a little extra runny. And even though I was going in extra light passes, I still dealt with some runs. Fortunately, it was on the front of the helmet where the blast shield would cover, and so I didn't worry about fixing those. On any build, I think it's good to know what you can and can't get away with hiding. Obviously, at every step on this project, I'm trying to make sure each thing is as perfect as it can be. But if I make a mistake, it's always nice to know that the next step or next layer is going to cover my imperfections. And on this build, I could get away with a lot more because a thick layer of mud was going to be covering the whole helmet. That's not to say I was being sloppy, but it was nice to know that I had that extra wiggle room. On these black pieces, I did a quick dry brush just to make sure that the edges looked a little worn. I didn't know if this step would even really show up underneath the coat of mud, but I figured it was better to have it than to not. I painted the rest of the resin printed pieces with Vallejo's blue-gray pale, and then moved on to painting the brim of the blast shield black. For the sake of speed, I hand-painted the gray areas on the helmet, and wasn't worried about the brush strokes because again, all of this would be covered in mud. I started to paint the blue stripes, but quickly realized how tedious it would be to try and get paint carefully into every little indent, so I decided to quit and instead just pack it with mud. Something that I didn't know, but learned while researching this helmet, is that Stormtrooper eyes are not black, they're actually dark green. So I cut out this welder's visor, which was a perfect color for the eyes. I then glued in all the resin printed parts. To give the mounting lugs on the blast shield just a little bit of extra strength, I drilled a couple holes down through the lug into the helmet and then covered a brad nail with super glue and stuck that down into the hole. I also made sure that the brim of the helmet was glued as strongly as it could be to the backside of the brim of the blast shield. For the backing of the frown, I used some window screen that I had laying around, folded it up into multiple layers so that it was extra thick and hard to see through, and then taped it in place with some HVAC tape. I have a bunch of this stuff laying around, and I use it anytime I need something that is flexible with a very strong hold. I started my weathering with a quick round of scratching. Like I said earlier, I wasn't sure if any of this was really going to show through under the mud, but I figured it was better to have that extra layer of detail just in case any of it popped through. Before the mud layer, I did an extra thick black and brown wash. I removed it from all the high points, but definitely left a lot more than I usually would. As I was moving around the helmet, I was using my hands to grab and smudge at the wash in strategic areas where I felt like this helmet would be touched if it were a real thing. So I was wiping away at the eyes, grabbing down at the sides as if I was removing the helmet from my head, just trying to do anything that would leave organic finger smudges as if this helmet had actually been in a muddy environment. I also used a brush to flick some of the wash to get a nice splatter effect, always making sure that the splatter came from below the helmet, just like it would if it was sitting on top of somebody's head. Then I moved on to the mud. For the mud, I used a combination of bentonite clay powder, matte Mod Podge, and black, brown, and green acrylic paint. I also added a little water to make the mixture a bit more soupy, and then went to town. This whole throwing the mud idea ended up being kind of unnecessary, but my heart was in the right place. Once I had packed the mud into all the recesses of the helmet, I went back with my hands and again started grabbing and smearing in strategic places. I used a little extra water on the top of the helmet to get some nice drips down the side, and then used my hand to make sure that the dome was a bit cleaner than the rest of the helmet. My goal was to make the helmet look like it had just been caught in a fresh downfall of rain. The next day, after everything had dried, a few of the areas were cracking, and I think this was because I left the helmet in front of a fan to dry, which I shouldn't have done. So I quickly made up a mix that was more paint and less Mod Podge and clay, and used that to dab around the areas that were cracking. After that, I mixed a bit more black paint into my mix and did a few more splatters, and then this helmet was ready for its glamour shots. If you made it this far into the video, thank you very much for watching. After last week's video, it was nice to do something a bit more simple with a quick turnaround time, and I'm very happy with the final result. If you'd like to see more from me, make sure to subscribe, since I plan to drop a new video every Saturday. And I'd like to say a big thank you to the almost 4,000 people who have subscribed to this point. I appreciate your viewership, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thanks again for watching. Have a good day.